Wanted to welcome everyone. I wanted to welcome everyone to this discussion, and it is about wild diseases, disease in wild birds in our in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And there are a lot of diseases that I can't cover in the time allotted here, as you can understand. So I have picked and choose mainly the high points in terms of diseases that I found to be most prevalent in our area. And they are, we will be talking about songbirds, but I will also be touching on as well some waterfowl issues, as well as some issues that affect raptors as well. So I know this is about wild birds, but I couldn't help starting with this slide because it was just interminably cute. So pardon me for my digression here. So let's go on to the next slide. And yes, this is a discussion primarily of songbirds, but we can't not talk about raptors to some degree here. I have a passion for raptor medicine as well from working at the Raptor Center for so many years. And obviously there are a lot of diseases as well that afflict raptors here, but we'll mainly be talking, as I mentioned, about birds that are hanging out at your feeders around your houses. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So songbirds, there are a lot of diseases that afflict songbirds, and some of it is a little bit confusing. So I am going to start my discussion on songbirds in general and talk about a couple of different specific diseases. And the first disease, Bernie, if you can go to the next slide, is actually a picture of a great gray owl. And there are a lot of different diseases that can cause morbidity, which is illness in birds, and mortality, which is death in our local wild bird population. And again, you know what? I spent a lot of time researching pictures online, and some of the pictures are just so cool, I couldn't ignore including them. So yes, we're talking about songbirds, but sorry, I had to throw in this picture of a great gray. So let's move on to the next picture. All right, so infectious diseases can be divided into actually 4 categories. I had sent an updated PowerPoint. This is the one that's a little bit older, and they can be divided in general into viral diseases, viral infections, bacterial infections, fungal infections, and parasitic infections. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So the first disease I'm going to talk about is songbird fever. And a lot of you are probably familiar with this particular disease. This is a bacterial disease, and it is due to Salmonella Typhamurium. Salmonella is something that is ubiquitous in all species, and unfortunately can be in a carrier state where the patient is not exhibiting any clinical signs, or in actually a clinically significant state. And that makes it really, really difficult. Also, Salmonella tends to hang out in the intestinal tract in our patients, whether we're dealing with dogs or people or birds. And it also tends to colonize in the gallbladder and the biliary system in birds, especially since we're talking about birds. That can be a really big problem. So we can see birds that look apparently what we call subclinically ill, that may not have any clinical signs, that are hanging out at your feeders and are acting as typhoid Marys. So as you may remember from school many, many years ago, Typhoid Mary was someone that worked in food service many, many years ago, and she caused hundreds of cases of food poisoning in the human population, again, many, many years ago. But there's many different types of Salmonella, but Salmonella Typhamurium is something that I saw actually quite frequently, especially it was one of the organisms that we would test for in our trumpeter swan population when we were relocating birds with the Wyoming Wetland Society. That was one of the one of the actual cultures, bacterial cultures that we would have to test for before those birds would be allowed to move interstate. As far as the pet bird population is concerned, we tend to see this more prominent in finches and sparrows. And obviously we have a high population of both of those species here. One of the recurring themes, oh, can we stay back on that slide, please, Bernie? Thank you. One of the important recurring themes that you'll see that I will keep repeating is zoonosis, and the fact that many of the diseases that I'll talk about tonight are zoonotic. And what that means is that there can be potential spread from non-human to human species. And we see a lot of cases of that. And I will keep bringing that up with my examples of some of the diseases that I'll be talking about tonight. And that is intentional. One of the other recurring themes you'll notice tonight is about hygiene and sanitation, because so many of these diseases, we can reduce the incidence of transmission between bird to bird, or from bird to people, or from birds to pets as well. And I'll touch on that in a second, by just proper hygiene. As far as pets are concerned, anything that's zoonotic that I'm talking about tonight has the potential, although there's different degrees of susceptibility between infection from birds to other mammals. So I'm concerned especially about transmission from our wildlife to people, but obviously being a veterinarian and straddling the line between being a veterinarian and being in public health, I'm concerned about pets as well. As far as songbird fever is concerned, we tend to see this more in the winter months. And that is mainly because birds are congregating in feeders more commonly in the winter months. So there's more increased chance for disease transmission. Bird feeders are the nidus for infection, with a lot of issues with songbird fever. And because it is Salmonella and a bacteria, it is really spread quite readily. Not only from feeders, but also from the seed that drops on the ground from a feeder, or if you have a multi-tiered feeder where the birds can defecate on the feeder or on the ground, and then you have ground feeding birds, as we all have, and they're down there foraging for seed that's fallen and may have been defecated on by another bird. So you can understand that the risk for transmission is really pretty high. The problem with songbird fever as well is the presentation of clinical signs. So we may have birds that present with ruffled feathers, or just depression where they're not moving as well. They may actually act like they're having some neurologic issues where they're very wobbly. They may be, as we call in veterinary medicine, NDRs or ADRs, meaning not doing right or ain't doing right. You may just notice that they're just not as reactive to stimuli. If a larger bird comes by that they would perceive as being a predator, they may not respond as rapidly as you would hope. The problem with songbird fever is that death, unfortunately, can be rather rapid. So we may only see or notice that we have a rise in deaths in our local songbird population. You may recall that songbird fever was discussed in the springtime here because we had a little bit of an outbreak in Idaho and some of the surrounding states. It does tend to be more prominent in other areas of the country, but there'll be pockets of infection. So what happened last year may be different than what happens this coming year, but it is here to stay most likely because of this subclinical carrier state where a lot of birds with Salmonella have it for their lives, and they can just have it in a subclinical state, what we call a commensal state, in the bird's body, in the intestinal tract, hanging out in the gallbladder and the biliary tree especially. And then maybe when they're stressed, they are shedding the organisms more so and creating a risk to the other birds that happen to be congregating, especially around feeders. And we keep talking about feeders because higher population of birds in one location, kind of like the concerns we have with chronic wasting disease in the elk refuge, for instance, when you have a lot of elk in a relatively concentrated area. So we do worry about that. So what's the best prevention? Well, one of the things that really bothered me, as I know I talked to Bernie about this as well in the spring, is taking down your feeders. I mean, I felt so badly taking my feeders down this past spring because I felt, oh my gosh, what are these birds going to do? Well, I reminded myself that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, these birds have been around a lot longer than we have. They get along. They don't need our feeders. There's plenty other sources of feed out there. So that, once I got over the emotional issue with that, I removed the feeders, and it's very important to disinfect the feeders. Most of you probably know the best way to disinfect it was with a 10% bleach solution, but you also may know that bleach is not a good cleaner, a good cleanser. So you want to clean your feeders first with Dawn detergent is one of the things that I like using. I use a bottle brush, for instance, and make sure, again, because of transmission, you want to be careful that you only use that bottle brush for your feeders and clean it really well with warm water and your feeders with warm water and Dawn detergent. Again, Dawn works really, really well because your feeders, if they have lots of black oil sunflower seeds or other seeds in it, as you know, those seeds have a very high fat content, and there'll be a coating of fatty acids on your feeders that you really need to use something that breaks down the fat. So I use Dawn detergent first, flush it out really, really well, and then use a dilute bleach solution. You can spray it in there if you'd like with a sprayer, let it soak in for a good 5 or 10 minutes. Contact time is really important. And then go ahead, as long as all the organic material has been removed beforehand with Dawn detergent. Again, this isn't trying to be a plug for Dawn. You can use whatever you'd like, but that's my favorite. And then once you've flushed it really, really well with clean water after disinfecting with Dawn detergent, with your bleach solution, you want to make sure it's really well air dried first. You also want to wait to hear from the authorities when is a good time to put your feeders back out again. I relied on U.S. Fish and Wildlife, their website, as well as the local game and fish websites. I think the communication networks are actually quite good. And there came a time, as I think Bernie even mentioned on the Bird Club website, if I remember correctly, where we had a green light to go ahead and put our feeders back out. So it was really a great day when I put them back out again. I'm just a sucker for watching my bird feeders, like most of you are. So hygiene, hygiene, hygiene. Bernie, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So not to make things more confusing than they have to be, but of course, a lot of times in medicine that happens invariably. So songbird fever is different than songbird illness. Songbird illness is not related to salmonella at all. With songbird fever, we know that's due to salmonella. We don't know what causes songbird illness. We do know what it's not caused by. So they've ruled out, a lot of the researchers have tried to rule out what the cause is, and we've tried to rule in things, but at the same time, by diagnosis of exclusion, we're ruling things out. And it's amazing. Many of you may know relatives or friends, like I have. My sister and family live in Columbia, Maryland. They were inundated with cicadas, you know, the brood X 17-year hatch this past spring and summer. It was untenable for people that live there. Researchers actually looked to see if that was one of the causes of songbird illness, some type of relation. And from what I read, that's been ruled out already. So they've looked at a number of different viral, fungal, and bacterial infections as a cause, and we don't really know what causes this. So anytime in medicine that we don't know what causes something, we call it really a syndrome. It is an illness, but it's a syndrome until we know what we call the etiologic agent is, which is what the cause is. I'm sure at some point in the next couple of years, they'll figure out what the cause is. It may actually be multifactorial. Sometimes it's not due to one agent, it could be multiple agents. Songbird illness has a broad geographic range. It is concentrated primarily in the mid-Atlantic states, but we've seen it all over the country. And again, it's a year-to-year variability thing. So This coming year in 2022 in the spring, hopefully we won't have this disease, but the likelihood is we probably will. But depending on climate changes from area to area, we may be seeing spikes and in certain areas that we didn't see spikes before. So the clinical signs, conjunctivitis is usually the first problem. That's inflammation around the tissues of the eye, and that can present itself as swollen eyes, crusty eyes, eyes with discharge. Oftentimes it will progress to neurologic signs, what I would call ataxia, which is imbalance, and wobbliness. Obviously, that can be really detrimental in terms of any potential for survival, because if they're neurologic, the likelihood is that they can't feed properly, and they certainly are more susceptible to being gobbled up by a predator, and it oftentimes progresses to death. This is not a good disease. It's frustrating for those of us that are clinicians or diagnosticians because we always want to know the cause. In this case, we don't know what the cause is. Going back to the common theme, this has been associated with bird feeders. So again, whatever this is, it is most likely infectious. How do we know that? Because the likelihood is, since we have lots of birds concentrating in one area, like in around bird feeders, and if there tends to be more disease when there's more bird feeders and more birds at feeders, then it doesn't take much of a stretch to see that there's probably a connection there. So common sense rules, hygiene, hygiene, hygiene. And again, that goes for us as well. I didn't remind everyone before, but anytime you're handling feed, and I'll get into that later, but anytime you're handling feed or handling the feeders, you want to make sure to wash your hands really well before you are handling any food. Obviously, do your best, just like we tell our little kids, don't put your hands in your mouth. I mean that, don't touch your eyes. Those are common sense rules, but it's amazing how often people touch their faces without even realizing it. So hygiene, hygiene, hygiene. Clean your feeders really, really well. You want to actually sweep up, if you can, any of the seed hulls and extra seeds that are below your feeders, because like we talked about before, that can be a cause of or a potential means of transmission as well. And you really can't overdo hygiene. So anything we can do in terms of our part to reduce transmission, and there's always a possibility some of these diseases may be transmissible to other species as well. In my reading, I didn't see that songbird illness was transmissible to people or to domestic pets. But again, you always want to play it safe and be conservative. The good thing about songbird illness that most of you know is that even though we didn't know what caused it and there really wasn't any treatment, I mean, the way we would treat this from a veterinary perspective is just supportive care, nursing care. If we had the ability to do that on a case-by-case basis. But what happened with songbird illness is that it was self-limiting. And what that means is it went away on its own. So we'll see what happens this spring. Okay, Bernie, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so I did a lot of research trying to find really cool pictures online. And this was one of my favorite pictures. So this is a red-winged blackbird that is alighting on top of a bald eagle. And this picture was taken in Minnesota. And many of you may know that red-winged blackbirds are quite territorial. And according to the person that took this picture, and this is actually not photoshopped from what I understand, this blackbird was swooping down, trying to discourage this bald eagle from being in his home range, in his territory. And then finally, he chased this bald eagle away and ended up landing on his back. And it's just such a cool picture. I had to share that with you. So I digress. You'll notice during this conversation and this PowerPoint that I have a tendency to digress a little bit. So, but I want to make sure nobody falls asleep during this. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, the next class of infections, and we'll start with infections first, are viral infections. So the first viral infection I'm going to talk about, which everyone I'm sure is familiar with, is West Nile virus. So next slide, please. Okay, West Nile virus. So I can't see the next slide coming up, which I should be able to see. So I may make some mistakes in the order here. I hope I won't mess up too much. But the most common birds that are afflicted with West Nile virus are corvids. And corvids are ravens and magpies and crows. And as we all know, I mean, I'm from the East Coast. We'd see crows, we wouldn't see ravens, but we see primarily ravens here. So I tried to Google pictures of ravens online, and this is what I came up with. Next slide, please. That's going backwards. Okay, the Baltimore Ravens, which I thought was kind of cute. So next slide. So for any of you that are from Maryland, yes, this is their team, the Baltimore Ravens. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So yes, I finally found a picture of a corvid. So this is a magpie, as we all know. You know, it's amazing for those people that don't live here, that come here and visit, how beautiful magpies are. I never forget the fact how gorgeous they are, even though they're kind of like pigeons around here. When I was in private practice, I had a lot of injured magpies come in. And the first thing somebody would say is, can you save it? And I'd always have someone say to me as well, why are you even bothering? It's just a magpie. And my response would be, well, you know what? We're all God's creatures, and it's not his fault he's a magpie. And why should we discriminate? I will tell you, magpies are tough as nails. Ravens are as well. I'm always amazed how big ravens are when I would see them in person, but they would often times do really, really well, even if they had some pretty serious illnesses or injuries when they would come in. I'd see a lot of magpies that were attacked by cats, and it was amazing how they would still try to peck my finger off or other appendages, despite the fact that they were pretty gravely injured. So next slide, please. All right, so this is a group of ravens, and since I can't hear you guys, but I can tell you that I'm sure many of you, if I asked you what a group of ravens or crows are called, would be able to easily tell me what that is. One of the most favorite activities I had when I was visiting Uncle Bert, and Bert Rains and I were very close friends, like a lot of you all were with him, was we would talk about what groups of animals were called, because there were so many euphemistic names. And as many of you know, ravens or crows are called either murder or a murder of crows or a conspiracy of ravens. And I just thought that was so cool. So let's go to the next slide. All right. This is a really great slide that I found on the Wyoming U.S. Fish and Wildlife website and Game and Fish website. It's amazing they had this, because this slide oftentimes we're at least a year behind or 2 years behind getting slides like this online. But this is the 2021 West Nile activity map for Wyoming, which is kind of cool, county by county. So if you look at the slide, you'll see that there was one case, and this is the human incidence of reported cases of West Nile in Wyoming county by county. And you can see there was one case in Teton County. There were a lot of cases, if you look at the slide, at the southeast, in the southeast region of the state. That is not by accident. I'll get into that in a minute. One of my recurrent themes, again, is zoonosis, zoonotic potential. So West Nile obviously is one of our biggest concerns in terms of transmission from birds to people, okay? But it's not that simple, and I'll get into that in a minute. So if you can switch slides, please. Hopefully the slide I put in later is still on here. Okay, great. So this is the life cycle slide for West Nile. And it's a really cool slide because it talks about who the prognosticator is with West Nile, and that's our bird population, our local bird population, especially songbirds, and the dastardly mosquito, all right? So if you notice, you can see on the left side, there's a horse, on the right side, there's a person gardening. And what do those two mammals have in common? They're outside. And the transmission, if you notice, it says that the horse is a dead-end host, end quote, quote, unquote. Same thing with the person. And what that means is that if either a horse or a person is infected, they cannot infect someone else. The life cycle has to go through a bird and through a mosquito. And the more mosquitoes that are bitten by infected, if a mosquito bites an infected bird, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, but if a mosquito bites an infected bird, that mosquito is infected and then bites another bird, and then that bird's infected, and you just get what's known as a bird amplifier effect. So the more birds that are infected, the more birds subsequently will be infected. And that increases the risk because you have infected, you have mosquitoes that are carrying the West Nile virus, and they have the ability to infect not only more birds, but other hosts, what we call these dead-end hosts. So this can actually affect other pets as well, but it's not as common as it is in horses. And the reason obviously is that horses are not typically brought in your home at night. They are outside 24/7. So they have more chance of getting bitten by a mosquito. People that are outside a lot also have the chance of getting infected, but certainly, as you can understand, not as much as a horse or other animals that are outside a lot. So birds are the biggest concern here, but again, the zoonotic potential is quite real. People die of West Nile virus. Oftentimes people get sick with flu-like symptoms and don't die, but if left untreated, and certainly if they have comorbidities at all, if they have other issues, if they're immunocompromised, there's a possibility for the disease progressing and becoming much more serious in that person. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, West Nile virus. I'm going to give you some facts in case you ever watch Jeopardy and they have this as one of the categories. West Nile virus is an arbovirus. As I mentioned, it is mosquito-borne. It is zoonotic, and that's really, really important. So anytime we have infections that can jump species, especially affecting people, that becomes a public health concern. It can infect, it's been known to infect over 250 species of birds. That's a lot of species. So that's also a lot of potential for that bird amplifier effect that was talked about or touched on in the last slide. As I mentioned before, there's increased risk for birds dying if they are corvids, meaning magpies, ravens, crows, and raptors. So there is a species predilection in terms of which species are more susceptible to having a more severe infection and disease course of disease. And I'll get back to raptors in a second. It is seasonal because it is mosquito-borne. So we tend to see more West Nile virus infections in the late summer and fall, not early spring. It takes a little while for this life cycle to occur. Doesn't mean that we can have exceptions to the rule, but it's much more common in late summer and early spring, as you can imagine, when mosquitoes are at their peak. And we've had the ability, the time lapse for the infections to spread to other species. Treatment is typically non-specific. The reason is that there really isn't any treatment. It's a viral infection. It's often diagnosed on postmortem. So when I was in private practice, I every year had people call me with songbirds or magpies, especially because we have so many magpies around here, or ravens. And our practice, Spring Creek Animal Hospital, as you may know, is located across from McDonald's. And every year I'd have someone that was in the drive-through line at McDonald's that would see a magpie hang around the dumpsters back there. that was falling over. And I'm simplifying matters, but that was actually the case. And of course, people would be very concerned. And oftentimes that bird had West Nile virus. If they could bring the bird in, then if I thought that it wasn't due to trauma, because certainly some other traumatic or infectious causes can mimic West Nile virus, oftentimes I would euthanize the bird. And unfortunately, if you're going to work with wildlife, that is part of the deal, is that there's a lot of euthanasia. You know, my job as a wildlife vet was always to return patients back to the wild. And and actually that's a legal issue as well. If they could not be returned to the wild, then I was obligated legally to euthanize. And I'm sure you can all understand the reasons for that. Lots of people would come in through the years that had songbirds that they turned into, quote, pets that were in cages. That is not what these birds are. That is not their purpose. And I don't want to get into a ethical or political discussion here, but it's kind of black and white in terms of the law, especially with migratory birds, what my job is. And it's a tough job at times, but it is something that I take very seriously. So if I did have the ability to treat one of these birds, it's supportive care. There is a possibility for birds to get over this virus. It's not always fatal, but it really depends on the situation. And unfortunately, finances can play a role as well in terms of what's done. If we have a high value bird like a raptor, certainly that may be a little bit different situation. Raptors, I was going to chat about that. So in my years at the Raptor Center, I don't really know what they're doing now because I'm no longer there. I had retired from being their staff vet and on the board. But when I was there, I was emphatic that they vaccinate their population of birds that were residents. So birds like owlie, for instance, were vaccinated for West Nile. So there is a vaccine. It's really only in raptors and horses. And as you can imagine, you want to vaccinate earlier in the summer or spring. So you have good immunity for when they need it most in the late summer and early fall. And the vaccine really is quite effective. It does cost money. So in not every situation is it possible, especially if you have many resident birds in chambers or in muses. It can be rather difficult cost-wise, but that is something we were fortunate enough to be able to do at the Raptor Center. Again, I can't speak for what they're doing now, but when I was the vet, that was something that I felt was a requirement. You know, it's really interesting. We don't really have a lot of West Nile that we've seen in the raptor population here. I can't speak with what's going on at the Raptor Center right now. Like I said, it's been several years since I've been on staff there, but when I was there, we didn't really see a lot of raptors with West Nile. And I'm good friends with the head of the exotics department at the veterinary school, Dr. Matt Johnston. And he even said down in Fort Collins, at the veterinary school, they just didn't see a lot of West Nile. And what he said in raptors, and what he said is that it's just so variable. It can be variable based on weather patterns and geography. Who knows if the altitude of where the location is plays a role. But again, year to year, it can be very variable. So what I'm saying now may not hold for next year. So prevention when we can, but unfortunately, as far as ravens, and when I was in private practice, seeing ravens and magpies, depending on how bad they were, I would actually try doing supportive care with them. And that's fluid therapy under their skin, and also tube feeding them, what we call gavaging, if they were able to be tube fed. And sometimes we could be able to pull these guys through. But unfortunately, since they were more susceptible to going in the wrong direction, euthanasia became the viable choice many times. So let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. Okay, next category is fungal infection. So again, I'm going to talk about all the different fungal types of fungal infections that I used to see in our area. But we'll focus on one in specific. So let's go and go into the next slide. Okay, Aspergillosis. That is something that is number one on the list of organisms, fungal organisms that I worry about. Asper is ubiquitous in the environment here. We get exposed to it every day, and our immune systems handle it. There are 3 different types of raptors that are more susceptible to Asper, and that actually entails all of the what we call the Arctic species: peregrines, goshawks, and gyrfalcons. So it is something that I actually saw here, but it was more common in falconers' birds, and falconers oftentimes, they have very high dollar birds, and they would also have hybrids. So I'd see a gyr hybrid, for instance. I treated one several years ago that had very, very severe Asper. This bird was worth a lot of money, and the owner was able to pay for the antifungal therapy, which was actually quite expensive. It was one of the more expensive drugs that we use in human medicine, and that bird pulled through. The problem with Asper is it can be very, very ubiquitous in the environment, and the signs can be very insidious. And I'll get to that in a second. So there are geographic differences. So where it's warm and moist, we tend to see more Asper. So it is drier and colder here, so we don't see as much Aspergillosis here. But if you go down, for instance, in the southeastern states, where it's very dry, very moist and warm, like down in Florida, they see a lot of Aspergillosis, especially in these species. So geographic differences play a big role. We're kind of lucky where we live because for the most part, it is dry and cold a lot of the year. So a lot of the infectious diseases where whether we're dealing with a bird or even dogs and cats, like tick-borne diseases, we don't see as frequently here. Certainly, I'm of the mindset with climate change that may be different as things are warming here. But since it was 12 degrees below zero at my house today, I don't know how long it will be before that becomes an issue here. Clinical course, since Aspergillosis, like a lot of fungal infections, is primarily transmitted by air. The main source of infection is aerosolized and goes into the respiratory system, the sinuses, and into the lungs. And then from there, it can go into other organs. If it's just localized in the upper nasal passages, certainly the outcome can be a little bit better, but this can be a real bear to deal with. Oftentimes the signs are nondescript. So some of these patients, or oftentimes these patients, come in with, again, that ADR, NDR ain't doing right, not doing right. A lot of birds that come in, and I speak for a lot of the pet birds that would come in that were owned as pets, whether they be Amazon grays or African grays or Amazon parrots, for instance. Occasionally I would see Aspergillosis, but a lot of times in birds, their job is to hide their illnesses. So a lot of these birds would come in and the owners would think they were doing okay, other than maybe they were a little bit quieter than normal, maybe off their feet a little bit, but they would be feathers and bones when I would see them. So, and a lot of these raptors that would come in, that's the way they would be. I mean, they were barely holding on in the wild. They were emaciated. And again, remember what I mentioned before, my job is to return these guys to the wild. So if they cannot hunt and function on their own, and the possibility for rehab, even if it takes 6 months or a year, if the likelihood for a good outcome is extremely remote, then unfortunately euthanasia is our best option. Obviously, that's not our main goal, but oftentimes with these fungal infections, it could be pretty tough. So they can come in with respiratory issues, maybe a very obvious or very subtle tail bob. Raptors, again, it's something that can be very hard to discern. Most raptors that would come into me in the Raptor Center were ones where somebody would be driving like past Skyline and they'd go to work and they'd see a bird on the side of the road and go, oh, that's weird. And they'd forget about it. And then they go home and they'd notice, oh, that's weird. That owl is still on the side of the road. And that's how in the Raptor Center, we get a lot of our cases from not owners, but from just locals being good Samaritans and noticing that atypical behavior with a raptor. So again, I'm going into one of my digressions, so I'll try to recorrect right now. So as far as what we can do to reduce the incidence of disease transmission, I mentioned before about hygiene. So if you notice, the last line this talks about husbandry or mentions that in muse management. So muse, as you know, are the chambers. So airflow is really, really important, having good air exchange in the chambers, and also making sure that you keep the area clean. That's really, really important. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay. My wife, MJ, Dr. MJ, grew up here. And if I asked her, her family moved here in 1969. And if I asked her back then, what do you think about the doves that live here? She'd say, what doves? You're crazy. Just like there were no raccoons back then. I've lived here for 30 years and there were no raccoons here as far as I know, as many of you probably are nodding your heads, 20 or 30 years ago. So we're seeing a lot more doves here. And with that is the possibility of certain diseases that they're more susceptible to. This is a mourning dove. As most of you know, we tend to see a lot of Eurasian collared doves here. I have doves at my feeders all year. And when I practiced in New York City at the Animal Medical Center, there were a lot of pigeons in the city, and believe it or not, with all due respect to pigeons, they were called flying rats in the city because they were basically petri dishes with wings. And I'm sorry to disdain them, but that's the way they were classified in New York City. Doves and pigeons, we do worry about certain fungal infections that are more common in them. I personally haven't seen any doves that have come in here with any of these fungal infections, but it's always in the back of my mind if I see a dove that may have any clinical signs of disease, whether it's nondescript disease, any respiratory disease, just not doing well, weight loss, ruffled, fluffed. There are 3 different fungal infections that are most common. One is called Cryptococcus, one is called histoplasmosis, and another one is called coccidioidomycosis. Coccidioidomycosis is also called valley fever. If any of you live as well in the Four Corners area, or especially in Arizona, a lot of clients that have houses in Arizona, there are a number of people that have had valley fever down there and gotten really, really sick. People can die from valley fever, and it's a fungal infection. It's soil borne. So when you disrupt soil, like if you're gardening a lot or if you're a farmer, and you're disrupting the soil a lot, you're aerosolizing these spores and you can breathe them in. So these are other infections. Again, these are fungal infections that are something that come to mind with me that I just wanted to mention today because they are infectious. So as far as the prevalence of doves in this area, it remains to be seen whether they become a nidus for infection in this area, as far as I'm concerned. But I sure like the way they vocalize in the mornings. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so let's go from infectious diseases to toxins. And there is some overlap between what I was talking about and what we'll be talking about moving forward. So contaminated feed, and this is a close-up picture of mold on corn, and mold and funguses, mycotoxins, myco means mold, they're all the same. And the incidence of mycotoxin infections from contaminated feed happen, it's really, really common. It happens every year. You read news articles about either people or especially livestock that have gotten sickened with mass die-offs due to contaminated moldy feed, especially moldy corn. So that oftentimes is due to storage issues and moisture. Moisture plays a big role. So if you have corn that's stored while it's not dried properly, for instance, and in a silo, and it's trapped in there, these molds, which again are ubiquitous in the environment, these molds will propagate, and oftentimes will they can release toxins. So they can end up in large enough quantities, not only cause livestock to be sick, or again, in isolated situations, this can be an issue with people and with domestic pets as well, but it can be lethal as well. Source is really, really important. Oftentimes when there's issues in agricultural settings, the FDA can actually, or USDA can trace this back to one or more sources of where the problem's coming from. So, but realize that anywhere along the way, you can have a problem with contamination. So if you're storing food, for instance, in a non-hygienic way at home, even, you risk the possibility for problems with mold. And, you know, we don't really have a lot of mold when you think about it around here. I have relatives that live in Seattle. Mold is just such a problem, black mold up there in houses. We're fortunate enough here, but I know there have been issues here since I'm on the Board of Health with mold issues here as well. So moisture, lack of good ventilation are a bad combination. So, and keeping things clean, again, is the most important thing. Just going to keep going back to that. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, talking about toxins, there's lots of different subcategories. So, and I've created these categories myself. So I hope they're okay and they make a lot of sense with everyone that's listening. So obviously, you know what this is. And one of the more common toxins we can see, especially in raptors and waterfowl, is lead poisoning. So let's go ahead and switch to the next slide. Okay, so lead poisoning, lead ingestion is on my list. And again, I did the top 3 here. Botulism, which is actually a clostridial organism, Clostridium botulinum. And I mentioned about waterfowl, contaminated water. And this obviously is a gaggle of, I hope that's the right word. I'm embarrassing myself here, but a group of ducks, mallards, and they're in algae infested water. So algae is a real problem. If you may remember last year at Brooks Lake Lodge, one of the ponds had dangerous levels of algae. That's becoming more and more of a problem across our country, likely due to climate change, from what I understand from the CDC and all the authorities. It's going to become more and more of a problem with climate change. So we're seeing a lot of these massive algal blooms, and every year people get sick. Domestic pets like dogs go into water like this and die, and waterfowl have the same problem. So this is pretty scary because there's no real treatment for it. The algae produces toxins as well. And again, treatment is really just supportive care. So it's really scary. It's going to be more of a problem. I'm trying to remember which website, but maybe someone can help me with this. But I know there was a list for Wyoming, for instance, of which lakes were deemed uninhabitable during certain times of the year in Wyoming. And I know there's sources for other states as well that are really a problem. I know down in Florida, they've had massive algal blooms where along the shoreline where beaches have been closed. So I do think that's going to become more and more prevalent of an issue as time goes on. So we see problems with contaminated water. I mentioned about contaminated feed, lead ingestion. I would love to say it's becoming less of an issue with copper bullets instead of lead, but there's still a lot of lead in the environment and in our waterways that's been there for many, many, many years. And I've seen so many cases of lead poisoning in raptors, in ducks, I've had ravens and magpies come in with lead poisoning. It can be really problematic. And you can have cases of chronic lead poisoning as well as low grade or acute cases of lead poisoning as well. So it's a real problem. It is treatable depending on how far along they are with the disease and how emaciated and any other comorbidities they have. But again, the treatment is really, really expensive. doing chelation therapy, as we call it. So unfortunately, finances play a role. But these are things that oftentimes are human influenced, and anything we can do to reduce the incidence of these problems is a good thing. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, I keep talking and trying to drive the point home about hygiene. And I don't want to ignore talking about these little guys, because I love, like most of us, hummingbirds. I mean, they just bring so much joy to me every year. And I think most of us are pretty good about changing the nectar out in our feeders. I don't know how often we clean the feeders, and it's really important to clean these feeders at least once a week. I hope most of us are doing that, and to change out the solution at least once a week. I think during the dog days of summer, and again, it's been hotter and longer, more frequent hot days here in Jackson compared to years past. This may become more important, but to maybe change the water out, the nectar out more frequently, because again, that's kind of a petri dish. Even though we boil the water with the nectar or sugar, just sun beating down oftentimes on these feeders, there's just no way to completely disinfect the glass jar or the plastic. So the likelihood of contamination of these feeders with time is actually quite high. And it's really important for us to do our part. So make sure to clean these feeders on a regular basis, and try to clean the plastic portions with warm soapy water, wash them out really, really, really well afterwards. I'm not as good at using a bleach solution with these feeders. Maybe many of you are better than that than I am, but I at least try to wash with my bottle brush and some Dawn detergent, and wash it really, really well, let it air dry in the sun if I can before I put them back out. But boy, these hummers, as you know, if those feeders are not out and I'm out there, they're just buzzing at me going, what the heck is going on? You know, I've been dependent on this and now you're taking it away. So I try to have an extra feeder around so that I can be swapping them out as I'm cleaning the feeder that was out there previously. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, hopefully many of you have not fallen asleep, but it is trivia time, all right? And the trivia questions today are related to our sage grouse population. So I know most of you know that a lek has nothing to do with a group of sage grouse. That is just where they're doing their strutting displays. But one piece of trivia I found was that the males play no role in raising of their young. And I'm not going to make any social comments about that, but shame on them. I also wanted to mention that a group of grouse have many collective nouns. I'm sure many of you know these, but I thought this was, again, so cool. They are referred to as either a chorus, a covey, that's C-O-V-E-Y, a drumming, a grumbling, or a leash. And Bert and I used to kid around about that. Again, just so cool, and one of my many digressions. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, we're almost done. This was another really cool picture I found online. This was taken at Rocky Mountain National Park down in Colorado. It is a bull elk that had just dropped his horns, his antlers. I'm so sorry, that was such a faux pas. Sorry, I'm a little tired. Just dropped his antlers, and there's a magpie sitting on his back. So I just wanted to mention that. It was so cool. I did want to throw in one other mention that I didn't mention, that I didn't state before. You can go to the next slide. Okay, before I get to cats, which are really important, I did want to mention, I love this picture, by the way. Some of you may have read online on your news feeds about avian influenza. So I'm a USDA accredited veterinarian in avian as well as exotic accreditation. And one of there's several different diseases that are just beaten into my head that are problematic in other areas of the world, not just the country, but the world. One of them is something called Avian Pox. Another one is called Pacheco's disease. And the most common one that's in the news is Avian Influenza, especially the H5N1. And there have been outbreaks in several areas of the world recently that you may have noticed in the news. One was in Israel, and another one was in the Labrador, Newfoundland region in Canada. And these affected large groups of poultry, and this can just blow through a poultry facility and usually results in isolation and quarantine and culling, which is a nicer word than killing, but culling means killing or euthanizing the entire flock. So I didn't want to be amiss in not mentioning avian influenza. It is not, in my experience, an issue here. Thank heaven. Hopefully it won't be in the future. I'm always on the lookout for avian influenza. It is a reportable disease. There are a number of diseases that are reportable, and that's any disease that is potentially transmissible to people. I'm required, as any accredited veterinarian is required, to report it to the authorities. But I did want to mention about H5N1 avian influenza. So moving on to other sources of disease or cause of disease or mortality in our wild bird population, predation. Okay, this very cute cat, and I have a cat at home as well, and he loves hanging out in bags. It's just so adorable when they do that. But domestic cats are killers, okay? They are hunters. And I could not believe the statistic from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 2019, 2.4 trillion bird deaths annually. Trillion. And I'm guessing that's probably underestimated. So any of us that have cats know what they do. They like hanging out below the feeders and doing their part and pouncing on unsuspecting birds or birds that may be ill and are not able to escape quickly enough, being hunted. So anything you can do to reduce the incidence of predation around your feeders, and even if you don't have feeders, the birds that are around your homes, would be a good thing. This is a big problem. I don't blame the cats. You know, this is what cats do. They're natural hunters. And unlike dogs that are omnivores, meaning they normally and need to eat herbivorous or vegetable matter and meat, cats are obligate carnivores. They certainly will like vegetables oftentimes. You know, they'll like gnawing on grass, and certainly if you grow your own catnip, but they are obligate carnivores. They need meat in their diet, and this is what they do. They're hunters. So we have to be their consciences. Other species, in addition to cats, can be causes of predation. And what I like to call the big fish, little fish phenomenon is just part of nature. So little birds are eaten by bigger birds that are eaten by bigger birds. So that, unfortunately, is just part of the natural life cycle. Little owls, cute pygmy owls, unfortunately, are picked off by great horned owls. And great horned owls can be picked off by bigger birds, and it just goes on and on. So it's really important to understand that some of this is just life. I, at times, have found feathers and bones of trumpeter swans in our pasture and feathers of raptors. And I'm always sad, but I also know this is just part of life. But things that we can affect and effect, for instance, when it comes to domestic cats, whatever we can do to do our part, I think would be helpful to all these birds that give us so much joy. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right. Other human-caused problems. Everyone has seen, I'm guessing, the imprint that's on this slide. I have a number of these on my windows. So these are window strikes. According to some estimates, about 600 million deaths of birds a year are due to window strikes. And I think that also is probably an underestimate. I would love suggestions from any of you. I've tried lots of options with my windows. Certainly there are times of the year where it's worse, when the sun is at a certain angle in the sky, where from the outside, our windows look like pure mirrors. Remember that evolutionarily, these guys don't know what a window is. So they think they're just flying, and then all of a sudden they get this massive trauma from hitting a window. I have found personally, just anecdotally, that the decals don't really work very well. I find, honestly, the best thing that works is when the sun is at a certain point, I just angle my windows open, I crank them open, which I'm fortunate to be able to do, and change the sun angle, change the way it appears to incoming birds. I also know friends that use various mobiles and wind chimes and other things that move and reflect to reduce the problem. But, oh, can we go backwards, please, Bernie? Great, thank you. So anything we can do to reduce the incidence of window strikes, I think, is a good thing. Motor vehicle accidents are another big issue. I used to see a lot of windshield strikes with owls. And the reason is that owls are not really good at vertical flight. So they would be feeding on carrion on the side of the road, and they'd be hanging out there at night, and they were very, very susceptible getting hit by incoming or oncoming cars. So it says here 215 million deaths annually. I really think that's an underestimate in our area. I think it's a lot more prevalent, especially what you see on the side of the road. Wind farms are something that is really an increasing issue. I think it becomes kind of a political football, personally, with wind turbines. A lot of the administrations years ago put rules in place to try to reduce the incidence of turbine strikes. What I have read is that it's becoming less politically expedient to protect raptors and focus more on energy concerns in our country. I know that a lot of, there was legislation, from what I understand, to reduce the incidence of wind strikes, raptors especially. But from what I understand, some of that legislation was actually quietly removed, even with the current administration. So that's kind of unfortunate, but the more wind farms we have, even with abatement possibilities in any types of research to try to come up with alternatives to maybe reduce the incidence of strikes with wind turbines, I think that's going to become more of an issue as time goes on, because there are more and more wind farms that are popping up because of our energy dependency. So that's a tough issue. You know, it's from what I understand, it's kind of a cost benefit thing, but here we are, we're all bird lovers. So it is really a tragedy. I think it's very much, from what I understand, underreported how many birds die at the hands of wind turbines, wind farms. So the last thing I want to talk about is habitat destruction and food source degradation. So pretty much everywhere in the country where there is the loss of wetlands and more development, whether it's a new shopping center going in or new housing developments, we have habitat destruction. And with that, we can have food source degradation and water degradation. So these all become issues, and they kind of build on themselves, because the more houses that are built, the more buildings that are constructed, the more possibility for window strikes, the more issues that we can have with conflict between our avian population, as well as our mammalian population, for sure, and people. I know one of the issues that I have around my feeders, and again, talk about 30 years ago, we didn't have white-tailed deer around here. We have lots of white-tailed deer. It's a real problem in our area. We live down in South Park, in southern part of South Park, in Sheernine Ranches. I can't tell you how much money I spend on sunflower seeds because of the white-tailed deer that come by every night and poach my feeders. and they're fat and sassy. I need to really figure out a way to raise up the feeders a little bit. But my gosh, I think I'm supporting Big R right now with all the bags of sunflower seeds that I am buying right now. I feel kind of guilty because I feel like they need to eat as well, but it's just amazing how much of a problem that's become. So things are changing in our world, and certainly locally they are, and anything we can do to adapt to what life's about. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So what can we do? And let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Cleanliness is number one. All right, let's focus on what we can do in our own world locally. And then if we can do things on a macroscopic level as well, that would be great, supporting organizations that can help our avian, wild avian populations here and abroad. But locally, keep it clean. And that has to do with cleaning your bird baths as well as bird feeders. Birds love pooping in water as well, as you probably know. And talk about illness, I always think about, first thing that comes to mind with me is Salmonella. So it's pretty much everywhere. So anything you can do to keep your feeders and your bird baths clean. Don't forget, bleach is a great disinfectant, but it's a very poor cleanser. So if you can, if there's organic material like feces, like seed that's saponified, oils and fats that are old on your feeders, you want to clean them first with a detergent, like a soap detergent like Dawn, and then disinfect with a bleach solution. Contact time is really important. So if you can at least have bleach contacting for 5 to 10 minutes, that's great. And then wash it off really, really well. If you want to be extra careful, you can certainly do another dish soap cleaning and then irrigate with warm water. That goes for seed as well. As I mentioned, keeping your seed clean, and also seed that is below your feeders, because that's a really big source of contamination, because what do birds do while they're eating? They poop. Same goes with your suet. Birds can contaminate that as well. You want to reduce predation from household pets. Again, this is something we can do in our own little worlds to make a difference. So remember, your cats are just doing what they have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They're hunters. So anything we can do to discourage them or keep them in would be great. And by the way, I've told my feline owners for years, if you want to keep your cats around for as long as possible, keep them indoors. There's less chance of them getting predated as well by, for instance, a raptor. And we've seen that many times through the years as well, or a fox or a coyote. But don't forget, when it comes to wild birds getting eaten by other birds, that is part of the natural life cycle of our food chain. And it's a tragedy, but that bird is becoming part of the greater good and providing a food source for other critters out there. And lastly, don't forget about zoonotic risks. So the common themes here have been cleanliness, but also the fact that a number of diseases that we can see in our pet bird population are also transmissible to people. So you want to make sure to wash your hands really, really well. Don't share, if you can, if you have like a laundry sink to wash, or a sink, if you're lucky enough to have one in your garage or mudroom, to wash your feeders. And you certainly don't want to ever wash stuff like that in your kitchen sink. And you want to separate what you're cleaning with, apart from anything you'd be using on your own dishes. I know this makes a lot of sense, and all of you know that, but it's amazing. It is something that we just have to kind of bring up, because sometimes we forget the obvious. So make sure you have brushes, a scrub brush, and a bottle brush that is dedicated just for using with your bird feeders and with birds. And it's a good idea to disinfect those by soaking them in a dilute bleach solution after you're done for 5 or 10 minutes. I love during the summer leaving them out to air dry, because the sun, as you know, is a good disinfectant as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I wanted to thank you all. Hopefully none of you have fallen asleep yet. And Bernie, that is amazing. It took me a while to come up with that PowerPoint origami flying away. Yes, Dawn detergent, and look at the pictures of those little cute ducklings on them. And
that's why you're recommending it. I know.
Well, and it is really the choice of avian veterinarians, as you know, with oil spills. And nothing looks better than Dawn. I also wanted to mention to everyone that I used to be the state liaison for Wyoming for the Association of Avian Veterinarians. They no longer have state liaisons, but I'm also a member of the Association of Avian Vets. And I love reminding people that the reason I was the state liaison was because I was the only member of the Association of Avian Veterinarians for the state of Wyoming. So I consider that a dubious distinction, but certainly very proud and honored to work with our local bird population. So
Dan, we're not going to take any questions this evening, but what I would ask everybody is if you have questions, please email them to jhbirds@gmail.com and I'll get them answered. But Dan, this is just a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for what you've done for birds in Teton County. It's astounding. You're one of the great heroes of the avian population here. And I want you to know that Bert always said that. So.
Well, like everyone else on this, hopefully people are still on this call. I know it's ran over a bit because of our technical issues, but it is really an honor, and it was really a passion that Bert and I certainly shared. I do want to let everyone know as well, even though I'm retired from clinical practice, I am still doing concierge medicine with exotics and avian patients. So if any of you have any birds that are not wild, I will help with the wild birds as well. But if any of you have any pet birds as well, you're welcome to email me, and Bernie can share my email address.
Yeah, let me know and I will give you Dan's email. And thanks so much, Dan. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, and I hope everyone had a good time and it was entertaining.
And just so you know, I have cats. We've always had cats. They're always indoors. And if you think that your cat is, oh, my cat doesn't do that. Yes, your cat does that.
Not his fault.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Stay safe. And if you have any questions, just reach out to Bernie. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. Best to MJ. I know she's lurking in the background there.
She is.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks.